So we will begin, as we usually do, with the reading the summary of the Parsha, the Parsha in a nutshell, as it's called. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to read it. You can follow along, but don't worry, there's no tests, so don't worry about it. So this is the summary. So the Torah, this portion begins. The portion is called Vayera, which means God appears. God reveals himself to Abraham 3 days after the first Jew's circumcision at age 99. But Abraham rushes off to prepare a meal for 3 guests who appear in the desert heat. One of the 3, who are angels disguised as men, announces that in exactly 1 year, the barren Sarah will give birth to a son. Sarah laughs. So Avram is sitting at the opening of his tent. He's healing from the circumcision, and he waits, and he's waiting for guests because Avram is a person full of kindness, and kind people want to give, and if they can't give, they are unhappy. So he's sitting at his desk, and he's at his desk. He's sitting at the opening of his tent, and he wants to give, but it was so hot, nobody's there. So God sends 3 angels. One of the angels tells Abraham that his wife is going to have a child. His wife at that point is 89 years old, so she laughs. Eventually, that's the name of her son. The son is laughter, Yitzchak, Isaac, which means laughter. Second paragraph of the nutshell, Abraham pleads with God to spare the wicked city of Sodom. 2 of the 3 disguised angels arrive in the doomed city, where Abraham's nephew Lot extends his hospitality to them and protects them from the evil intentions of the Sodomite mob. The 2 guests reveal that they have come to overturn the place and to save Lot and his family. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt when she disobeyed the command not to look back at the burning city as they flee. While taking shelter in a cave, Lot's 2 daughters, believing that they and their father are the only ones left alive in the world, get their father drunk, lie with him, and become pregnant. The 2 sons born from this incident father the nations of Moab and Ammon. Story continues. Abraham moves to Gerar, where the Philistine king Avimelech takes Sarah, who was presented as Abraham's sister, to his palace. In a dream, God warns Avimelech that he will die unless he returns the woman to her husband. Abraham explains that he feared he would be killed over the beautiful Sarah, and that's why he said she is his sister and not wife. God remembers his promise to Sarah and gives her and Abraham a son, who is named Isaac. Yitzchak meaning will laugh. Isaac is circumcised at the age of 8 days. Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah 90 at their child's birth. Hagar and Ishmael, which we read about in last week's parsha. Hagar was Sarah's maidservant, who then marries Abraham because Abraham did not have children, and Sarah asked Abraham to marry her maidservant, and she gave birth to Ishmael. But in this case, Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael are banished from Abraham's home and wander in the desert. God hears the cry of the dying lad and saves his life by showing his mother a well. Avimelech makes a treaty with Abraham at Beersheba, where Abraham gives him 7 sheep as a sign of their truce. The most southern city in biblical Israel, not in modern Israel. Modern Israel, Eilat, is the most southern point. After they gave back the Sinai, which I guess at that point, before then, I guess it was Sharm el-Sheikh was the most southern point. But in any case, in biblical Israel, the most southern city is Be'er Sheva, and it means, Sheva is a tricky word. It could mean 7, but it could also mean oath. So he gives 7, that's where the oath, it was called Be'er Sheva because that's where Abraham makes an oath and peace, a treaty with Avimelech. I guess it's the first peace treaty in the Middle East recorded in the Torah. God tests Abraham's devotion by commanding him to sacrifice Isaac at Mount Moriah, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Isaac is bound and placed on the altar, and Abraham raises the knife to slaughter his son. A voice from heaven calls to stop him. A ram caught in the undergrowth by its horns is offered in Isaac's place. Abraham receives the news of the birth of a daughter, Rebekah, to his nephew Bethuel. So there's a lot of information here. If it's the first time you're hearing it, it's a lot to process. But what we're going to do is perhaps we will look at some of the stories, as is our custom, and we'll analyze some of them. The ones we do, hopefully we will read them inside so we get a little bit of a taste and a little bit of a feel for what's taking place. So we begin the journey. The first thing I want to talk about is what we began to talk about last week, but I didn't conclude. And I don't know if she's here, but Elisa said that I have to talk about it this week. So that's what I'm going to do. There are, generally speaking, there are really two portions in the Torah that discuss this life story of Abraham himself. A little bit is next week, but most of it, next week, it's just the first reading where we discuss the purchase of the burial spot for Sarah. But there are really two portions. Last week, Lech Lecha, and this week, Vayera, when God appears to Abraham. So the question that we raised last week is the division of the portions. Why are the portions divided seemingly in middle of an episode? Why do I say it was divided in the middle of an episode? Because we just finished reading in the end of last portion that Avraham circumcised himself, and the opening phrase of this week's portion is, as you could see on the screen, Genesis chapter 18, verse 1. Now the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. So God appears to him. Now, why does God appear to him? So we have a trick button here, Chabad.org, they're amazing. Show Rashi's commentary. That's a trick. Show Rashi's commentary. And the Lord appears to him, if you look under verse 1, the first comment of Rashi, to visit the sick. That's from Tanchuma, the Medrash. Said Rabbi Chama, the son of Chanina, it was the third day from his circumcision, and the Holy One, blessed be he, came and inquired about his welfare. So Rashi says, why does God come and appear to Abraham? Because Abraham was sick from the circumcision, and God comes to visit him to visit the sick. It's a great mitzvah called Bikur Cholim, visiting the sick. So before we get, so the question is going to be, so this verse is really part of the previous story. It's part of the aftermath of the circumcision. So why do we divide the story of the circumcision exactly in half? The act of the circumcision, and then God coming to him after he is healed, to heal him from the circumcision. I would think the story should divide either before the circumcision or after this story. And maybe Sodom, the story of Sodom, should be the beginning of the next story. So that's going to be the question. But before we get to the question is, where does the Medrash, Rashi quoting the Medrash, where do they pull this out of the box? How do they decide that verse 1 that says God appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, how do they decide that means to visit the sick? Maybe it's for something else. Like where do they come up with that information? So you could say it was passed on from tradition. Maybe not. I don't know. But there is a way to derive it from the verse. So that's the question. How do you derive from the verse that God comes to Abraham to visit the sick? And the answer is, at least one of the answers, is that nowhere in the Torah does it say that God comes to somebody and not then conclude and say why God visited. Usually it says God appears to Moses, for example, or even to Abraham, and he tells him, go and move to the land of Israel. There's always a communication that follows, right? God doesn't just appear to hang out, to have a coffee, or to have a beer. God appears and conveys information. That's the meaning of God appearing. It's a revelation. So there's information being conveyed. This is the only time in Scripture that God appears to somebody and does not give any information. So this begs the question, why is it that God appeared to him? So that forces the Medrash, and therefore Rashi, following the Medrash, Rashi quoting the Medrash, forces us to say God did not come to convey information. So why did God come? Oh, so you have to understand from the context. What's the context? We know he just circumcised himself. Okay, so now there is a visit to heal him to visit the sick because now he is ill because of the circumcision. So that's just an interesting thing. When Rashi or the Medrash quote something, it's a given interpretation, and seemingly it doesn't say it explicitly in the verse, but almost always, if you think carefully, you'll be able to find the biblical source the biblical source for the biblical source for that forces the Medrash and is the source of Rashi's commentary. So that's just to clarify why Rashi decided that we're talking about visiting the sick. Now we have to get to our question: why are you dividing the story of Abraham specifically at the place in middle of the story of the circumcision? In other words, we read about the circumcision, and then we read, you would think that the continuation is, and God came to visit him post the circumcision. No, that's a new parsha. So the commentaries explain as follows. The reason why the split happens at this point is because it's a different person. The Torah wants to emphasize that Abraham before the circumcision and Abraham after the circumcision are two different people. And therefore, you have to divide the portion. In other words, through the circumcision, Abraham reaches a completely higher spiritual level. He's on a completely different plane. Okay, where do you see this in the story? That also you could see within the story. What happens is that there's a few pieces to at least two pieces to the puzzle. So let's put out piece one and then we put out piece two. Piece one to the puzzle. What is the significance of the mitzvah of circumcision, which is really essentially the first mitzvah that God gives Abraham is the circumcision? And the Kabbalah explains that circumcision in some sense represents all of the Torah. So in some sense, what every single mitzvah, what every commandment seeks to do is really expressed in a very tangible way in the mitzvah of circumcision. What do I mean? I mean that Judaism, the idea of what religion is supposed to do, is very different in Judaism than in other faiths. In most faiths, the concept of religion is to ask, how does one become more spiritual? How does one become connected to God by escaping the pull of materialism and connecting to spirituality? That's why other faiths, they would preach the idea of a person should be secluded from the world. You have monasteries where people separate themselves and segregate themselves from the world. And if you're a certain type of religion, you're not going to, we think that the priest shouldn't marry, etc., because being involved in the material world is really a distraction from cleaving to God. That's essentially most religions. I'm not going to say all, I'm not an expert on religions, but essentially religion is a path of becoming more spiritual. Now, Judaism does want you to become spiritual, but that's not the core of the religion. The core of the religion is not to escape physical life. The core of the religion is to sanctify physical life. The core of the religion is to bring holiness into every area of life. In other words, if God wanted us to be spiritual, then he would just keep us in heaven and we would all be angels and we would be dancing all day long and singing holy, 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 and that's it. That's not what he wanted. What did God want? God wanted us to bring holiness to the most unlikely of places. What's the most unlikely of places? The physical world. So in other words, every time you do a mitzvah, what you're doing is actually fulfilling the purpose of creation by imbuing a physical object within holiness. So you're taking a coin, a dollar. A dollar is not very holy, even though within the dollar it says in God we trust. So that's good. But you're taking something that's physical, completely physical, and you are using it to give charity or to help another person. You're using it to do something good. So by virtue of that, the actual dollar becomes holy. And think of any mitzvah you're going to do. Every mitzvah you're going to do is going to be involved with taking something physical and transforming it to spiritual. You put a mezuzah on your door. What are you doing? You're taking the skin of an animal and you're making it holy. A Torah scroll, a Shabbos candles, whatever you're going to do, there's going to be a mitzvah involves taking something physical and transforming it to spirituality. In other words, bringing spirituality to the physical, because that is the purpose of creation from the perspective of the Kabbalah. Okay. Of all mitzvot, of all mitzvot, where is that mitzvah expressed even the most within the human body? That's, of course, the mitzvah of circumcision. Because the mitzvah of circumcision, as God said in last parsha, is, this is my covenant in your flesh. So it's very tangible that by doing this mitzvah, the physical body was changed. So if I put tefillin on my arm, the tefillin have been transformed. Now my arm becomes more holy, but You have to be able to see the holiness. You have to be a mystic to see the holiness that's in my arm. But a circumcision, it's tangible how the holiness penetrates the physical flesh. This is not me saying, this is God saying. That's what God said last week's Parsha. This is the covenant in my flesh. Okay, fine. That's the first piece of the puzzle, the uniqueness of the mitzvah of circumcision. Now let's look at the second piece. So what's the result of circumcision? So now in Abraham's life, in Abraham's life, holiness becomes part of his life, and he doesn't have to escape life to interact with God. And this is the big transition that happens in Abraham's life. And we can go back and look. We'll see if you're interested. We'll go back and I'll show you. But last week's Parsha, when God would appear to Abraham, the verse says, Avram would fall on his face. And Maimonides explains that sometimes when a prophet receives prophecy, the prophecy is overwhelming. And the prophecy, the person forgets where he is. He goes into a trance. And the prophet would fall to the floor and make funny sounds. And that's why in the Bible, not in the 5 books of Moses, but in the Bible, the prophet is called, everybody heard the Yiddish word of a meshuganer, someone who's crazy. In the prophets, a prophet is called a meshuga, a crazy person, because when the prophet would experience prophecy, sometimes that would be an overwhelming experience. The person would lose all consciousness of what's happening with his physical body, roll on the street or roll on the floor, etc. So last week's Parsha, Abraham has the experience of God. He has that revelation. And what happens? Abraham falls on his face. This week's Parsha, drum roll, and is a completely different person. How does that happen? It happens as a result of the circumcision. What does verse 1 say? Now the Lord appeared to him in the plains of Mamre, and he was sitting at the entrance of the tent when the day was hot. Avram is sitting at the entrance of his tent, and God appears to him. Now, what does that do? Does that make him go in a trance? Does that make him forget everything that's happening in the world? So let's read verse 2. And he lifted his eyes and saw, and behold, 3 men were standing beside him. And he saw, and he ran toward them from the entrance of the tent, and he prostrated himself to the ground. What's happening here? Abraham is simultaneously experiencing the revelation from God and simultaneously being able to interact with the guests. Okay? It's not a trivial matter. This is a transformation where the holiness, the revelation of God, does not overwhelm him. The revelation of God is integrated within his life. How does that happen? That happens because of the circumcision. So in other words, the takeaway of the circumcision is, the message of the circumcision is that to become too close to God, you don't have to run to the synagogue. You don't have to run to the study hall. You could be in your home. That's why we do Zoom in the house. You could be in your house. You could be in your home. You could be in the place of business. You could be engaged in physical acts and yet still be connected to God. And that's the new thing that happens in this parsha, in this portion. And that is a result of the circumcision, because really the mitzvah of circumcision, in addition to being God's will, and it's a covenant, but what it represents is the ability of the holiness to penetrate and permeate the physical body and physical reality. So we experience Judaism, we're really experiencing a post-circumcision type of religion, in other words, type of faith. In other words, what we're supposed to be doing is what we experience, our understanding of Judaism is influenced by Abraham's ability to integrate the divine revelation and at the same time being able to interact with other people.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
What is the implication of his willingness to sacrifice Isaac in terms of his worldliness or otherworldliness? It seems that he was being asked to do something that was for the sake of spirituality and a retreat from this worldly examples.
That's an excellent question, because it almost goes, not almost, it really, it almost undercuts everything I'm saying, which means that with the last, 22 minutes has been a waste of your time, which would be a shame. I would feel really bad.
I know you have an answer, Rabbi. I would have asked.
I was hoping you're not going to ask. It's the end of the portion. It's the hardest part of the Torah to explain. I was hoping you're going to overlook it and be distracted by the beginning. But
overlook it. Okay, I'm sorry.
No. On a serious note, let me get to the circumcision. Let me get to the binding of Isaac later. It's later in the story. It's a very difficult portion to understand, because the reason why it's so difficult is because, like other biblical stories, it's told in a very factual, matter-of-fact way. We're told what Abraham did. We're not told what Abraham felt. And that's why, or Isaac for that matter. That's why it's a very tricky portion to try to interpret, but we're going to take a bite at it. I don't know if we'll be successful, but let's hold that for a moment. But again, the point of the matter is that Abraham could be, for so far, you're asking a good question, put it on the back burner. Please don't forget about it. Don't let me go off the call without at least addressing it. Addressing it may be saying, I don't know the answer, but at least we'll address it. So let's put that out there. But to summarize, Abraham is different now. Abraham now can do simultaneous things. In other words, he can be in the world and yet relate to God. Okay, fine. What else is happening in this parsha? What's the big shift in this parsha that also would explain why the portion is divided here? Almost will explain. But let's think about, we're trying to find the big theme of this parsha, and that will tie us into the binding of Isaac, and that's hopefully will come for a circle and get back to Jill's question. Okay, according to the Kabbalah, we know that Abraham, we have three patriarchs. I think we mentioned this last week, or if we didn't, we should have. No, I think we did. There's three patriarchs for the Jewish people: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the reason why we have three patriarchs, it's not by accident. It's because they each represent a certain emotional quality, and they are the patriarchs because they pass that quality to every one of their descendants. In other words, there are three primary emotions, and we possess those three primary emotions from the three patriarchs. And just to run them by quickly, Abraham represents chesed, kindness, loving kindness, giving. Isaac represents discipline and strength and holding back, or awe, call it awe, not the expansion of self, but holding back. And we'll elaborate upon that when we get to the stories of Isaac in either next week or in 2 weeks from now, depending on what we decide to do. And then you have Jacob, which is compassion, which according to the Kabbalah is the blend of kindness and discipline. How so? Because the kind person wants to give everybody, regardless of if they are deserving. The disciplined person only wants to give to those who are deserving. And the person who is compassionate is some sort of combination. He doesn't want to give everybody. He says, in other words, let's go back. The kind person, Abraham, who's giving everybody, Abraham sees the good within everybody. He doesn't see anybody as non-deserving. Some people are so loving, they can't imagine that somebody else is not as loving as they are. Some people are so positive, they can't imagine that someone else is negative. So Abraham is in that class of people. He doesn't see anything bad in anybody. That's chesed, that's kindness. What is Isaac? Isaac is discipline. You have to earn. You have to hold back the love until the person earns it, right? You have two parents. One parent wants to help the child and give the child the answer to the homework, and the other child says, no, don't tell him, because if you tell him, you're not helping them. So that would be chesed and gvura. That would be giving, loving kindness, and holding back and being disciplined. And that's Abraham and Isaac. And then Jacob is the combination, because Jacob is almost like a combination. How is it a combination? How is compassion a combination? Because compassion agrees that not everybody is deserving. So in that sense, he agrees with judgment, with discipline. On the other hand, compassion says that I'm giving you despite the fact that you're not deserving, because we have compassion. So it's not exactly kindness. Kindness sees everybody as deserving. Discipline demands the person to earn what they're getting, and who only wants to give what the person earns. And compassion says, I agree with discipline that you're not deserving. I could see that you're not deserving, but I'll give it to you anyway because I have compassion. So that's the breakdown, how the three patriarchs represent the three primary emotions of love and discipline and compassion. And we can go into this for an hour, but the bottom line is these are the three primary emotions. And of the three, it's really two. It's really love and discipline, or love and fear, right? Love is flowing outward, trying to connect to something or somebody. I want to become one with somebody or something outside of me. And fear is the opposite. Fear is I'm running away from something outside of me. So love is flowing outward, and fear is flowing back to myself. So that's the two ideas of giving and discipline. Am I flowing outward? Is my soul flowing outward? Or is my soul flowing back to self? And these are the primary two emotions. They merge to become the third, which is compassion. Then they become 7, and then they become 49. And then you get all the different shades. So everything you're going to feel is going to be, any emotion a person experiences is one of these combinations, one of these shades of these primary emotions. Okay, fine. Now, what is the problem with love alone? The problem with love is if you only give love and you have no discipline, there's going to be a few problems. One problem is that you're going to give the love to the wrong places. And if you give love to wrong places, you're actually going to cause more damage than good. If a person gives too much love, or a person gives love in a way that's not focused love, a person can end up giving love to the wrong places. And then what happens is that you're actually empowering the negativity. You're empowering the evil. And it takes a certain discipline to be able to show love and direct love to the right places. Even within somebody's life, I'm very loving, I want to express myself. But if I express myself in an undisciplined way, I'm not going to achieve everything. Because every day I wake up in the morning and I say, oh, today I'd love to climb the Everest. Tomorrow I love to run the marathon. The next day I love to become a doctor. A day later I love to become a lawyer. I'm not going to achieve everything. You have to have discipline. And the discipline is the way where you focus the love, and therefore you can achieve something powerful. So Abraham in last week's Parsha represents ultimate kindness, represents almost perfect kindness. In this week's Parsha, beginning from the end of last week's Parsha, beginning from the circumcision, you will see that story after story, what's happening is Abraham is going through a transition where, because of the circumstances, he is forced to apply discipline to his love, and not only live in a way of love, but also in a way of discipline. Now, another way of saying love and discipline is saying love and devotion and commitment, right? Because typically, we discussed this in the past, that when I say I love somebody, really what I'm saying is I love myself. Because why do I love you? I love you because of the way you make me feel. I love you because of what you do for me. So ultimately, love returns to self. What is service? What is commitment? That's when I do something for you. I don't want to do it. I don't love doing it, but I'm doing it for you. So I'm putting myself aside. I'm not doing what I want to do, and I'm being devoted to you. So devotion is very different than love, at least the way I'm using it. When I feel love, what does I love? I love to be with you. So why am I helping you? Why am I with you? Because I love it. It's all about me. I love it. Devotion means I don't want to be here. I'd rather be somewhere else. But because you need me to do this, that's why I'm here for you. That's not love. That's discipline. And I know in America they think that all you need for a relationship is love, but that's simply not true. According to the Kabbalah, it says just like a bird needs 2 wings to fly, so too a relationship needs 2 wings to get you off the ground. A relationship is a feeling; it's a spiritual thing. It has to fly up. It has to defy gravity. And your relationship, your feeling of connection to another person needs 2 wings. What are the 2 wings? Both love and discipline, both love and commitment. So if I'm in a relationship with you, and I love to do, we have all kinds of activities that we love to do together, but I'm only going to do the things that I love to do, and I'm never going to do something that you love to do. Okay, it's going to last, but that's 1 wing. How long could you fly on 1 wing? A relationship, there has to be a time where I say, you know what? I'm a loving person. I want to express myself, but now I'm not going to express myself. Now I'm going to be disciplined, and I'm going to do something for you, not for me. Because that's where the service begins. That's where a true relationship begins. That's where I go beyond myself and I connect to you. The fact that I hang out with you because we both love going to the same restaurant, I'm really serving myself. I love to eat here. I need someone to laugh at my jokes. So I invite you to be in the relationship so you can laugh at my jokes. That's really what's happening here, if all I have is love, because love is self-serving ultimately. On the other hand, service and relationship and discipline is, I don't want to do it, but I'm doing it for you. That's commitment. And in biblical Hebrew, it's called fear. In America, we don't like to use the word fear. So, excuse me, I'm just gonna delete that synonym. But when the Torah says you should fear God, it doesn't mean you should fear God. Oh, if I don't do what God wants, God is going to send a lightning and zap me into shape. That's not what fear God means. Fear means awe. Awe means seeing the other person, not seeing the self. Awe means commitment. Even when I don't feel the love. And a relationship must have 2, must have both. Now, Abraham is going through a transformation because story after story in this parsha, what is required from him is to suppress or to channel his unlimited love. And what God is telling him, you have to channel your love. You have to love in a disciplined way. And to love in a disciplined way, you have to say no to distraction and you have to say no to other things. Primary example would be when he doesn't want to send away his son Yishmael, and God says, no, listen to Sarah, send away Yishmael. Okay, because he's causing damage to your other son Isaac. This is probably this is the story written right before the story of the binding of Isaac. Other than binding of Isaac, this is the hardest thing in his life. The hardest thing in the life of a parent to have to send away a son. But sometimes the only way if you just give love to your son and in an inappropriate way or in an inappropriate time, you're not really helping the child. And I'm a loving parent, but I have to be disciplined about it. And for Abraham, this is very difficult. He doesn't want to do it. He only does it because God almost forces him to do it. We know that Abraham was tested with 10 tests. We're not sure exactly what they are because the Torah doesn't list it. We know that the binding of Isaac is the test, is the 10th. But most people believe sending away Ishmael is the 9th, the second to hardest test. Okay? And every story throughout this process is showing Abraham that you need love, but your love has to be disciplined. Now, the binding of Isaac, of course, is taking this story to the extreme, because God is saying, take the son you love and offer him as an offering. And this is a very difficult story to understand, and I'm not sure how to swallow the story. There's different angles, but let's say what the Torah says about this story. Okay, what does the Torah say about the story? So I'm going to share the screen for a second, and let's see if we could see what the Torah says. Again, I'm not talking about all the. We're not ready to talk about all the details of the stories yet, because we have other stories we want to talk about. But I just want to talk about the theme of Avraham going beyond love and experiencing commitment. And the ultimate commitment is the readiness to sacrifice his child. So what does it say at the end of the story of the binding of Isaac, which is the story we read on every Rosh Hashanah? God is very, so let's read. You don't have to hear my commentary. So he's about to slaughter his son. This is unbelievable. And verse 10, and Abraham stretched forth his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So it's about to happen, the last minute. And the angel, verse 11, and the angel of God called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Verse 12 is the most important verse for the purpose of our discussion. And he said, do not stretch forth your hand to the lad, nor do the slightest thing to him. Don't do it. Don't harm him. So why did Abraham schlep? So Abraham is like, so, okay, so why did you schlep me here to Mount Moriah for 3 days to put my son on the altar if you don't want him as a sacrifice? So here we get the verse that gives us God's intention, or what God was looking to find out. For now I know that you are a God-fearing man. Ki yirei Elokim ata, you fear God. What does it mean now? Now you knew all the things that Abraham did earlier you didn't know? So we say no. Ultimately, the other things could be motivated from love. Love is, I love you. I love how you make me feel. I love the relationship. So I'm doing it for you. But I love it too. I love the experience. But to understand that you need both wings, you have to be able to have commitment. Being in a relationship, certainly being in a relationship with God, requires going beyond the self and saying, I'm here for you, not for me. So the ultimate test for Avraham is to see if he has the second wing. The first wing, Avraham is a lover of God. That's written else. That is implied in many places. It's not written explicitly in the Bible until you get to the prophet of Isaiah, which was the Haftorah of last week, where God refers to Abraham as the Jewish people as the children of Avraham who loved me. So Avraham is the lover of God. Now we know, now here's the big news. The big news is that Avraham is not only the lover of God, but Avraham also has awe of God, meaning its commitment. So this is the way we think of the entire Parsha. The entire second Parsha is, could Avraham learn to focus the love? And that's what happens with the city of Sodom. Avraham prays for Sodom. But eventually, when he learns that there's no salvation, then he has to agree with God, with God's justice. And that's a process that he goes through himself. He himself has to understand that loving the wicked ultimately is not love. There's a statement in the Talmud that says that if you have compassion on the cruel, you end up being cruel to the compassionate, right? If there's a terrorist that wants to kill you and you say, oh, you're so nice, I'll be nice to you, I don't want to kill you. What you're really doing is you're really being cruel to the victims of the terrorist. So in other words, being loving all the time is a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful trait, but you need to sometimes be able to produce the second wing. And the second wing is to go beyond their own nature. And for Avram, it's the commitment. I'm just going to say one more thing on this thing because I really like this idea. It's really, really nice. And I think so, at least. And then we'll see what else we want to talk about. So let's talk about the conversation here. God tells Abraham in the beginning of the story, the binding of Isaac, he says, okay, take your son, the one you love, and bring him up as an offering on one of the mountains that I will tell you. So, verse 3, Abraham arose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took his 2 young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split wood for a burnt offering, and he arose and went to the place which God has told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from afar. Okay, we don't want to read the whole thing. Verse 6, and Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering, and he placed it upon his son Isaac, and he took into his hand the fire and the knife, and they both went together. Now, simple story is Isaac is oblivious. He doesn't really understand what's happening here. How do I know? That's verse 7. And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father, and he said, my father. And he said, hey, here I am, my son. And he said, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? What are we doing? We're going to offer an offering. We have fire, we have wood, we have a knife. We have everything we need except for the main ingredient. The main ingredient is the offering. Verse 8, and Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. This is what he says. He's ambiguous. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. The way Rashi reads the verse, God will provide for himself a lamb for the burnt offering, and if not, if we can't find anything, it will be my son. In other words, he sort of hints to the fact that there's a possibility that the sacrifice is none other than Isaac. And that's why the verse continues, and they both went together. Rashi says that means Isaac agrees and doesn't protest, it doesn't run away. Just like here in verse 6, before he knew he's the lamb, it says, and they both went together. Before Isaac knew he's the sacrifice, it says, and they both went together. After he's told that there's a possibility that it's his son, that it will be Isaac, again, it says, and they both went together. Rashi makes that point. Okay, but let's take from the Kabbalistic perspective. Abraham is a loving person. He's all about love. Isaac is all about discipline. Now, maybe we'll have time to talk about it. That is why Abraham is much more closely connected emotionally with his son Yishmael. Because according to the Kabbalah, and you see it in the stories as well, Yishmael is also love. So Abraham has 2 sons. One is one is very similar to him, and Isaac is very similar to Isaac's mother, Sarah, which is discipline and strength. Who is Avram connected to? Avram connects to his son Yishmael. Avram doesn't have an emotional bond with Isaac. And you know what? Isaac doesn't have an emotional bond with Abraham. They don't understand each other. One is all about love, self-expression, I want to give. And one is all about discipline, holding yourself back, not allowing self-expansion. And they have, if you do the math according to Rashi, at that point, Isaac was no lad. How old was Isaac? People think he must have been 4 years old if his father could sacrifice him. But Abraham was, according to Rashi and the Medrash, if you do the math, Isaac was 37 years old. So they're living for 37 years together. They really don't have a bond. They don't have an emotional bond. And where do you see it? Because they're so different. And where do you see it? You see it that never in the Torah is there a conversation between Abraham and Isaac. There's no conversation. You have a conversation between Abraham and Sarah. You have a lengthy conversation between Abraham and Abraham's servant that we'll read about next week. You have all kinds of conversations, but no conversation between Abraham and his son Isaac. It's no mistake. Because they didn't bond. I'm not saying they never spoke, but they didn't bond. They didn't have an emotional connection because they were so different emotionally. Now, the first time they speak, okay, this is where the drama begins. When is the first time they speak? The first time they speak is on the way to the binding of Isaac. Verse 7, as we read, and Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and he said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. That's all you need to know. Forget about the end of the conversation. Isaac senses, even though he asks, who is the lamb? Where's the lamb? Isaac senses that it may be him. So Isaac senses that this loving father that I always have, and I don't really understand love. I understand discipline. I don't understand love. Now I see that my father actually understands discipline. He understands the concept of service, of devotion. So he says, my father, I see that you're my father. You're not some person that's completely strange to my psyche because you're all about love and all you know is love and you have no ability to discipline yourself. So he says, you're my father. And what does Avram say? Avram says, here I am, my son. Now I see that you're my son. Now I see where you come from, because now I see that I am able to produce the same feeling that you had, or which is your personality, which you exhibit for the past 37 years. So now is the connection. This is the ultimate place where there's an integration between the kindness and the discipline. Abraham appreciates Isaac's discipline, and Isaac appreciates that Abraham's love is also disciplined. But that only happens at the culmination of the story, because that's the highest point where Abraham becomes God-fearing. And as we said, God-fearing is a synonym for the concept of devotion, going beyond himself, escaping the self, as opposed to love really is just expression of self. So that
are you saying that Isaac, understanding discipline, was willing to sacrifice himself, to let himself be sacrificed?
That is the Kabbalistic notion, which is why we call it the binding of Isaac. In other words, we say this was a test to Abraham. The opening phrase of the parsha, if I can get the screen up here to prove my point, you don't have to believe me, because I know you need faith for other matters. I don't want you to waste your faith on believing what I'm saying. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. So I ask you a question. God tested Abraham. What about God testing Isaac? Isaac is 37 years old, prepared to sacrifice himself. Is that not a test for Isaac? The answer is it's not a test for Isaac. Why not? Because the ability to sacrifice for Isaac is exactly that's his nature. That's right up his sleeve. Isaac is prepared to sacrifice himself for God. Isaac is a person who really wants to escape the reality of the world and connect to God. So for him, it's nice, but it's not a great test. Test means, could you be completely transformed? So this is primarily a test for Abraham. And I have verse 1 to back it up, to prove my point.
Rabbi, that's the explanation of the Quran. And it was because it was Ishmael in the Quran that was being sacrificed, and he went willingly.
Of course. But now let's flip the coin. Now this will come back to Jill's original point. What does God want from us? God wants that we have the willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to escape, the willingness to be spiritual. But nevertheless, we go off the mountain and we don't sacrifice our child, and we don't sacrifice life, and we come back to life on this earth. In other words, in the language of the Kabbalah, which you heard many times, there's running and returning, ratzo and shuv. And this ties into your earlier question. This ties into why the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is not a contradiction to what I said earlier. And this ties into how the Jews and the Muslims read the binding of Isaac differently. What's the takeaway from our story? What is the Jewish takeaway? The Muslim takeaway is you have to be ready to kill yourself for God. That's true, but that's only part of the story, because Jewish people throughout history were willing to give them their sacrifice themselves to God. Not only them, but also their families and children. And in some ways, even though they didn't have great communication from direct communication from God. That's the story of Jews for the past at least 1,000 years, ever since the Crusaders. People are willing to give up their life for God. It was very common, unfortunately, if you lived in Ashkenaz in Eastern Europe, first in Western Europe, in Ashkenaz, Western Europe, in the Dark Ages, and then in Eastern Europe, it's very common. So that's certainly a takeaway, but that's not the takeaway. That takeaway is you have to be prepared to sacrifice yourself and your child to God. You have to be prepared to sacrifice, but then you have to know that God doesn't want that sacrifice. What God wants is the conclusion. The conclusion, if you want to see, this is actually very nice. The conclusion of the portion. What's the conclusion? What's the culmination? We finished the binding of Isaac. God gives him unbelievable promises. God says, I'm going to bless you, and gives him promises. verse 17, 18. I would stop at 18. 18 is like the most powerful verse. All through your children shall be blessed, and through your children shall be blessed all the nations of the world, because you hearken to my voice. That's the culmination of the blessings that follow the binding of Isaac. Stop, that's enough. What does the verse conclude? And Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham remained in Beersheba. What's 19 telling you? 19 is Abraham goes back to normal life. Okay? So what does God want? God wants you to run and return. God wants you to have a desire to escape the physical world and want to cleave to God. That's when you pray, you say Shema, you cover your eyes and you say, I love you, I love the Lord our God, love the Lord your God. That's all I want. I want to connect to God. You have to run. But then you have to return. Then you have to say, I want to love God. Of course, I want to come close to God. But what does God want from me? God has a mission for me, and the mission for me is to be in this world. So am I serving myself or I'm serving God? If I'm serving myself, then I'm willing to die because my soul wants to return to God. But it's not about what I want, it's what God wants. What does God want? God wants me to be on this world. So in other words, to take a man like Abraham, it's not so hard to get somebody to want to be willing to sacrifice their life for God. It's not so hard. It's doable. The Arabs do it, other people do it. It's not so hard. But then, like the saying goes, it's much harder to get someone to live for God. In other words, to be able to have that commitment to God, not as a one-time thing, I'm willing to kill myself, but to be able to take that commitment and experience it simultaneously while living daily life. That's Abraham. That's the Jew. And that's full circle to the beginning of the Parsha, because the beginning of the Parsha is you could be sitting at your tent in the middle of the day, interacting with your guests. You're feeding them. Avram gave them elaborate food. He gave them tongue. He gave them animals. He took care of them. And while he's interacting with people, he experiences God's revelation. And it's simultaneous, because that's what Judaism is about. That's the paradox of Judaism. The paradox of Judaism is that we're not escaping, we're returning. But of course, you have to be prepared to escape. In other words, you have to have the desire to escape, and yet you have to come back to daily life. There's a teaching in the Mishnah, the Ethics of the Fathers, that says as follows. It's a very cryptic statement. It says, Al karcha chata chai, al karcha chata met. You live against your will, and you die against your will. Okay, this is confusing. If I live against my will, means I want to die. But if I die against my will, that means I want to live. So what is it? Do I want to die or I want to live? What's my attitude to life? Some people spiritual people wake up in the morning and say, I wish I wouldn't be here. I wish I would be an angel in heaven. I don't want to live. Unfortunately, they have to live. They have to go to work. They have to pay bills. They have to change diapers, etc., etc. Some people don't want it. On the other hand, the Mishnah says, when it comes to die, that's against your will. You have to want to live. So what do I want to? Am I supposed to cultivate a desire for life? Or cultivate a desire for death? What's the answer? The answer is a Jew is a paradox, both. I want to escape my body to cleave to God, and that I experience through prayer. When I try to become spiritual, that's what I told you, that Judaism, of course we have spirituality in Judaism, but that's not the focus, that's not the purpose. So I want to escape, I want to cleave to God, but then I have to return. I have to say, I want to cleave to God. But what does God want me? God wants me to experience that passion within the world. In other words, realize that to connect to God, I do not have to escape the world. I don't have to sacrifice my son. I don't have to climb Mount Moriah. What I could do is I could take the inspiration of the binding of Isaac, of the willingness to have a complete commitment to God, and come back to the lads, and come back to Beersheba, and come back to my shop, and come back to daily life, together with that ultimate willingness to commit to the will of God. Like I said, it's easy to die as a Jew. It's easy to die for Judaism. It's hard to live for Judaism. And that's really the paradox what Judaism wants us to do, to have that inspiration, to have that willingness, that passion to be able to say, I want to escape everything. All I want is God, but experience that while I'm eating breakfast. Oh, that's a challenge. That's what Judaism is. That's why we have spirituality in the religion, and we pray. And prayer is to cultivate that desire for spirituality. But that's not the goal. That's not the purpose. The purpose is go back to your lands, go back to Beersheba, raise a family, impact the world, do exactly what Abraham has been doing and what we have been doing ever since. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a story in short. I wasn't going to speak about, there was so much more to talk about, but I think a full circle. We started out with the uniqueness of this parsha, explaining how Abraham, after the circumcision, is able to integrate the holiness into his life. And therefore, when he has the revelation of God, when he has this awareness of spirituality, he doesn't fall to the ground. He's able to maintain that awareness even when he's interacting with the guests. And in some sense, that's reflected at the end of the parsha of what he's really doing is he's going back to daily life together with the commitment he had, with the devotion he had at the moment of the binding of Isaac. He's almost capturing that devotion and bringing it back to life. And that's the paradox, and that's complicated. And that's one angle of how to read the entire story. In other words, where the story is going. When you open up the parsha in a nutshell, you could have read just a bunch of episodes that are unrelated. But upon deeper analysis, the story is going somewhere. There's this character development. Avram is developing. So that's one area of development. And the other area of development is Abraham's willingness to not only a lover of God, but someone who's in awe of God. In other words, someone who has commitment, as opposed to commitment means I don't do it because it makes me feel good. To the contrary, I'm doing it because you want it. And in every relationship, I'm not saying you should be willing to sacrifice your child for a relationship. I'm just kidding. But in every relationship, if you say, I'm here because I love it and I love everything about this relationship, and nothing about this relationship requires me to sacrifice. Sacrifice is not a bit, I don't mean in a dramatic way, but sacrifice, I mean, I'm doing what you want, even though I don't want to do it, even though it's inconsistent with my nature. If I don't have any of that, then it's not a real relationship. And ultimately, it's going to crash. So,
Rabbi,
yeah.
what is Isaac's, according to Chabad understanding, what is Isaac's takeaway from this experience?
Isaac's takeaway, according to the Medrash, Isaac is somewhat traumatized. In other words, by this event, in the sense that he he's considered holy, and therefore God does not allow him to leave Israel. He's always in a state of like being on top of Mount Moriah. But I'll tell you one thing. I'll tell you that the entire story of next week's Parsha, I can't tell you how many verses, many, many verses. It's probably the most drawn out story in all of the 5 books of Moses, is what? Abraham trying to find a wife for Isaac. We don't hear a lot about Abraham's marriage or Jacob's marriage a little bit, but we don't hear not that many verses. And certainly the other people in the Bible, here there's almost a full parsha, every nuance of how Abraham seeks to find a wife for Isaac. And the story is actually repeated in the Torah multiple times, because first the Torah tells us what Abraham tells Eliezer, then how Eliezer actually carries it out, then how Eliezer recounts it and tells it to the family of Rebekah. It's repeated two or three times in the Torah. It's unbelievable. Why? What does this represent? What's the significance? The significance is, first of all, Isaac needs a wife. It's very easy for Isaac to be prepared to sacrifice himself. Therefore, he needs a wife to ground him. But I'll say even more. The entire story is telling us that Abraham wants a woman who is kind. And that's the whole test of Eliezer. He says, I'm going to ask a girl, could you give me water? And the girl who'd say, yes, I'm going to give you water. And I'm also going to give you water to your camels. She is the one perfect for Isaac. Now, there's no test of beauty. There's no test of genetics. There's no test of, does she believe in God? Right? You would think Abraham is preaching the one God. He goes back to the pagans in Haran. He should ask the girl, do you believe in God? I mean, I would think that should be the requirement. None of that. The only requirement that Abraham has, the only important thing for the marriage is she kind? Why is kindness so important? Was Sarah that kind? Not necessarily. But the point here is that because Isaac was Gevurah, because Isaac was disciplined, then to be able to produce the next generation of the Jew, you have to have the integration of discipline and love, and discipline and kindness. So just like Abraham and Isaac, just like Abraham and Sarah, Abraham is the loving one, and he has to marry Sarah, who's the disciplined one, and in order to produce the next generation of Jew. So the next generation, it flips. Isaac is more like his mother, but Rebekah is much more like Abraham. She's actually related to Abraham. So it switches. The Gevurah type, the Gevurah personality needs chesed to taper him. And I'll tell you one thing, that the only place in the Torah that I know for a fact Not the only place, but the first place. It says that Jacob's also loved. The first person that it says in the Torah that he loved his wife, you would be surprised. Who loved his wife? Who's the first one to love his wife in the Torah? Of course, everybody loved their wife, but it doesn't say it. If it doesn't say it, means it's not a big, it's not, the Torah is not drawing attention. The first one that it says explicitly that he loved his wife is Isaac. Isaac meets Chesed, meets his wife, and he marries her. Vaye'ahveha, he loves her. That's next week's Parsha. She influenced him. She taught him how to love. By the way, it doesn't say he loved her before they got married. It says he married her, he brought her into the tent of his mother, and he loved her. The love comes after the marriage, as opposed to Jacob, who loves Rachel at first sight. Why? Because it's a big deal for Isaac to start loving, right? But Rivka, because her nature is to be a loving person, she rubs off on Isaac, and Isaac loves his wife. And that's a big news because Isaac is not about love. Isaac is very committed. He's a very committed husband, but is he a very loving husband? You wouldn't expect so, but that's exactly what the Torah says. Why? So Avram's entire plan and all those verses in the Torah with Eliezer trying to do exactly what Avram said, to find a wife that is suitable for Isaac, and the only quality they looked for, they didn't, today you have if you sign up to the dating sites, they want to match you based on 29 points of compatibility. There's no compatibility there. There was only 1 point, and they weren't compatible on that point. Isaac was not loving, and she was loving, and that's all they cared, because that's what holiness is. Holiness is that you have to have the balance between love and discipline. And like I said, the Torah itself says he marries her and he loves her. So he also is his task is to develop the concept of love and within himself, and then they can produce the next generation, which is Jacob. And according to the Kabbalah, Jacob is the true fusion of love and discipline, and therefore Jacob is ultimately the father of the Jewish people, and Jacob is successful in raising all of his sons within the fold of Judaism, as opposed to Abraham and Isaac. But that's already beyond the scope of this discussion. In other words, if you only have love or you only have discipline, you're only going to reach some of your children. So Abraham affects Isaac, but not Yishmael, because too much love is not healthy for Yishmael. And Isaac is disciplined, too much discipline. So he impacts Isaac, he impacts Jacob, but Esav separates from Judaism because Esav, it's too much discipline for Esav. So he's not able to, Isaac, both Abraham and Isaac are not able to influence all of their children. Jacob, because he's the fusion of the love and the discipline, therefore he's able to tailor his love and his discipline to what the child needs. And therefore, even though his children were imperfect, but they all remained within the fold of Judaism. So that is a little bit of I would say it's the Parsha in a nutshell. We have a lot, of course, there's a lot more to talk about. God willing, God will give us many healthy, long years. We'll be able to study Torah for many years to come in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Really appreciate it. I had fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.